The crash of glass was the first sound, a glittering explosion that ripped through the sleepy afternoon hum of redemption. It was followed by a woman's scream, sharp and jagged, and then the deep, authoritative roar of a shotgun. Dust and sunlight swirled together in the doorway of the Redemption Bank and Trust as three masked men stormed inside, their boots thudding against the polished floorboards. Jedediah, who had been standing at the mercantile counter across the street, arguing the price of salt pork, froze. His hand reaching for his coin purse stopped midair. The world, which for years had moved at the slow, deliberate pace of the sun and seasons, had just lurched into a violent, chaotic sprint. Panic erupted on the street. People scattered like quail, ducking into alleyways and storefronts. Jedediah, however, remained rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the bank. His instincts honed by a past he fought daily to forget, screamed at him to draw his own weapon to intervene. But another deeper instinct, the one that had built a fortress of solitude around his heart, told him to stay out of it. This was not his fight. He had no stake in redemption's gold. Then he saw her. A little girl no older than 5 stood paralyzed on the boardwalk directly in front of the bank. Her mother had presumably been swept away in the initial wave of fear, leaving the child stranded. She wore a simple calico dress, and her dark hair was a mess of tangled curls. In her small, outstretched hand, she clutched a silver locket, its chain dangling between her fingers. As the leader of the bandits, a tall, broad-shouldered man, whose charisma was palpable even through his bandana-barked orders inside, the little girl let out a terrified whimper and dropped the locket. It hit the wooden planks with a soft metallic clink and skittered to a stop near the edge of the boardwalk. The sound was insignificant against the backdrop of chaos, yet it cut through Jedediah like a razor. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that locket. Not just one like it, that locket. The intricate floral engraving on its surface, the way the silver caught the light. It was identical to the one he had given his wife Sarah on their wedding day. The one she had been wearing the day she died. The world narrowed to that single gleaming object. The shouts from the bank, the terrified whispers from the townsfolk hiding nearby, the frantic whinny of a spooked horse. It all faded into a dull, distant roar. In his mind's eye, he saw Sarah's hand, her slender fingers tracing the same floral pattern as she smiled at him. He saw the locket lying in the dust of Blackwood Gulch, spattered with blood that wasn't hers, but felt like it was. The little girl Ruth began to cry, her small shoulders shaking. The bandit leader Silas emerged from the bank dragging a teller with him. Anyone tries to be a hero, he boomed, his voice carrying an unnerving blend of charm and menace, and this one's the first to meet his maker. We'll be on our way. But Jedediah was no longer listening. He moved without conscious thought, his body propelled by a ghost. He stepped off the mercantile porch, his long strides eating up the distance across the dusty street. Whispers followed him. "It's Jedediah. What's he doing?" He ignored them. His focus was singular, the girl and the silver heirloom that had inexplicably appeared from his buried past. He reached the boardwalk and knelt, his calloused fingers closing around the locket. It was warm from the sun, and for a heart-stopping second, he expected to open it and see Sarah's face smiling back at him. He looked up at the girl. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were fixed on him, a mixture of terror and confusion. "It's okay." Jedediah heard himself say, his voice a rough rasp. He held the locket out to her. "Here." As her tiny, trembling fingers brushed his, Silas turned his head, his eyes cold and sharp above the bandana locked onto Jedediah. A flicker of something recognition, amusement, contempt passed through them. He shoved the teller forward and took a step toward the boardwalk. "Well now," Silas drawled, his voice like honey laced with poison. "Look what we have here." a knight in dusty armor. Jedediah stood slowly, placing himself between Silas and the girl. He didn't reach for the Colt at his hip, but his posture shifted his body, settling into a stance that was both defensive and deadly. The years of practiced solitude had not dulled the edge of the man he used to be. Silas chuckled a low, dangerous sound. "Picking up strays, are we? You should be careful. Sometimes they belong to someone else." His gaze flickered from Jedediah to the locket, now safely back in the girl's hand, and then back to Jedediah's face. The amusement in his eyes hardened into something calculating and cruel. Before the standoff could escalate, one of Silas's men shouted from inside the bank, "We got it all, Silas. Let's go." Silas held Jedediah's gaze for a second longer, a silent promise of unfinished business passing between them. Then he turned, vaulted onto his waiting horse, and spurred it down the street. His men followed, their saddlebags bulging, leaving behind a cloud of dust, shattered glass, and a town holding its collective breath. The silence that descended was profound. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at the little girl who was still staring up at him, her fear slowly being replaced by a fragile sense of awe. He had just wanted to retrieve a piece of his past, but in doing so, he had stepped back into the world, marking himself in the eyes of a dangerous man. The silver locket, a symbol of a love he had lost, had just become a hook, pulling his tragic history into his isolated present with a force he was powerless to resist. The quiet of Jedediah's ranch was a world away from the chaos of redemption. Here, silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, woven from the whisper of wind through tall prairie grass, the drone of cicadas in the afternoon heat, and the distant cry of a hawk circling a vast, indifferent sky. His cabin was a testament to his solitary existence. A single tin plate and cup sat on the dusty table. One chair was pulled up to the hearth. The bed in the corner was made with military precision, the quilt smoothed over a mattress that had only ever known the weight of one man. After the robbery, the shock had given way to a gnawing unease. He'd spent the rest of the day in a haze, the image of the locket seared into his mind. Now, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting the endless expanse of sun-baked earth in a fiery glow, he sat cleaning his rifle. The rhythmic slide and click of oiled steel was a familiar meditation, a ritual that usually calmed the restless ghosts of his past. But tonight, it offered no peace. His hands moved with their usual meticulous care, but his mind was back in redemption, kneeling before a child who held a key to a door he had long since bolted shut. From a small locked chest beneath his bed, he retrieved a worn leather pouch. Inside was a photograph, its corners soft and frayed. A young woman with kind eyes and a smile that could gentle the wildest stallion stared back at him. Sarah. Tucked behind the photograph was its twin, a silver locket, its floral engraving dulled with age and sorrow. He held it in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. It was identical. There was no doubt. How was it possible? His memory, a beast he usually kept chained, broke free. He was back in Blackwood Gulch, and the air thick with tension. A card game, a foolish accusation of cheating a challenge issued by a hot-headed young man named Kane. Jedediah hadn't wanted the duel, had tried to walk away. But Kane's pride, fueled by whiskey and a cheering crowd, would not allow it. Sarah had begged him not to go. He could still hear her voice pleading. But honor in those days was a currency he couldn't afford to devalue. The memory played out in short, sharp flashes, the blinding glare of the sun, the cold weight of the Colt in his hand, the single deafening crack of gunfire. Kane fell. And then a second shot, a stray bullet from one of Kane's panicked friends, they'd said, and a scream. Sarah's scream. He saw her crumple to the ground, a crimson flower blooming on the front of her dress. The life he had known ended in that instant. He had fled not from the law, but from the ghost of his wife, the guilt of his actions chasing him across the plains until he found this isolated patch of land where he could serve out his sentence of silent grief. A sharp knock at his door shattered the memory. Jedediah's head snapped up his hand, instinctively closing around the stock of his rifle. He wasn't expecting visitors. He never was. He moved to the door, his steps silent, and peered through a small crack in the wood. It was the town doctor, a weary-looking man named Miller, his face etched with concern. Jedediah eased the door open. "Doc." Jedediah Miller said, his eyes scanning the sparse cabin. "Sheriff Elias sent me. He thought you might... Well, after what happened in town, he was worried." Jedediah grunted, offering no invitation for the doctor to enter. The townsfolk of Redemption mostly kept their distance. Sheriff Elias was a fair-minded man, but wary his world-weariness, a shield against the town's dark undercurrents. Doc Miller, however, had a way of seeing past the surface, his gaze often lingering on Jedediah, with a hint of sad understanding. "I'm fine," Jedediah said, his voice flat. Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Are you? The whole town is buzzing. You stepping out like that, facing down Silas Blackwood?" Silas Jedediah's grip on the rifle tightened. So the bandit had a name. That's what he calls himself. He and his crew have been trouble waiting to happen for months, terrorizing folks on the outskirts. But they never hit the town proper before today. The doctor hesitated. "It's not just about the robbery, Jedediah. It's about the girl. Ruth. She's been asking for you." Jedediah's heart gave a painful thud. "Why?" "I don't know. But her mother, Tabitha, she's in a bad way. The sheriff found them holed up in an alley behind the saloon. Someone worked her over something fierce. Looks like it happened last night." Miller's expression darkened. "No one would help. People are scared of whatever trouble they're running from. They see a beaten woman and her child, and they just turn their backs." The doctor's words hung in the air, heavy with the town's collective shame. Jedediah thought of the girl's terrified eyes, her small hand clutching that impossible locket. He thought of the whispers and averted gazes as he'd left town. A familiar bitter taste filled his mouth. He looked past Miller toward the distant lights of Redemption twinkling in the twilight. A quiet life was all he had asked for, a penance paid in solitude. But the past had reached out and tapped him on the shoulder, not with a ghost, but with a living, breathing child. Without another word, Jedediah stepped past the doctor, leaving the cabin door swinging open behind him. He strode toward the corral, where his horse stood silhouetted against the deepening twilight. "Where are you going?" Miller called after him. Jedediah swung himself into the saddle. He didn't look back, to see about a girl. The alley behind the saloon stank of stale beer and despair. A single lantern hanging from a rusty nail cast long dancing shadows over piles of discarded crates and refuse. In the deepest recess of the shadows, Jedediah found them. Ruth was huddled beside her mother, a threadbare blanket pulled up to her chin, her small body trembling against the night's chill. Tabitha lay on a heap of old burlap sacks, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her face was a canvas of purple and blue bruises, her lips split and swollen. She was barely conscious. Ruth looked up as Jedediah approached, her eyes huge and dark in the flickering light. There was no fear in them now, only a desperate, pleading hope. "Mister," she whispered, her voice cracking, "Mama won't wake up all the way." Jedediah knelt, his gaze sweeping over Tabitha. This was worse than Doc Miller had described. This was the work of a man who enjoyed cruelty. He gently felt for the pulse in her neck. It was there a faint, thready flutter, as weak as a trapped bird's wing. "We need to get her somewhere warm," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady. He looked around the filthy alley. The town's judgment felt like a physical presence, a wall of indifference that had left this woman and child to waste away in the dark. He carefully slid his arms beneath Tabitha, preparing to lift her. She moaned softly, a sound of pure agony that tightened the knot in his stomach. "I'll take them," Jedediah said, looking up as Doc Miller appeared at the mouth of the alley, medical bag in hand. Sheriff Elias stood behind him, his face a grim mask in the lantern light. Elias shifted his weight, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You sure about this, Jedediah? You don't know what kind of trouble you're inviting. Folks are saying Blackwood's crew was looking for them." "Folks can say what they want." Jedediah replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He lifted Tabitha into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and pain. Ruth scrambled to her feet, her hand immediately finding the fabric of Jedediah's coat and clutching it tightly. Doc Miller stepped forward. "At least let me look her over at my office. She needs tending." "She needs a safe place more," Jedediah countered. "Your office has a glass window, same as any other place in this town." He looked directly at the sheriff. "I'm taking them to my ranch. No one will bother them there." Elias held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, weary nod. He understood. In redemption, safety was a commodity, and Jedediah's isolation was the most valuable currency he had. As Jedediah carried Tabitha out of the alley, a few curious townspeople who had gathered at a distance fell silent, their judgmental whispers dying on their lips. They watched as he mounted his horse with the unconscious woman held securely against his chest, and then lifted the small girl to sit behind him. Doc Miller pressed a small bottle of laudanum into Jedediah's hand. "For the pain, a few drops in some water. And get some broth into her if you can." He then looked at Jedediah, his expression searching. "Why are you doing this?" Jedediah settled Ruth behind him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. He looked down at Tabitha's bruised face, her dark hair spilling over his arm, and then thought of the locket. He thought of being abandoned by the world. His answer was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, because no one else would. With a final nod to the sheriff, he urged his horse forward, leaving the flickering lights and hushed gossip of redemption behind. The vast dark prairie opened up before them, a sanctuary of silence. As they rode, Tabitha stirred her head, lolling against his shoulder. A faint broken whisper escaped her lips. "Daniel, I'm sorry." The name meant nothing to him then. It was just a fevered murmur in the dark. He tightened his hold, shielding her from the wind, and rode on, unaware that the ghost he was trying to save was inextricably tied to the one he was trying to outrun. 2 days later, the riders appeared on the horizon. Jedediah saw them from the porch, 4 silhouettes shimmering in the midday heat. He had been splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a counterpoint to the quiet hum of recovery inside the cabin. Tabitha was awake, though, weak, propped up on pillows in his bed. Ruth, having finally shed the shell of her fear, chattered away as she arranged pebbles in patterns on the floor. The sounds, a woman's soft breathing, a child's quiet play, were so foreign to the cabin that they felt almost sacred. Jedediah set the axe down his body, going still. He recognized the confident, almost lazy way the lead man sat his horse. It was Silas Blackwood. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped back inside, pulling the door halfway shut. "Ruth," he said, his voice calm but firm, "go sit with your mother. Don't come to the window." The girl's chatter ceased. She looked up, her eyes wide with renewed fear, but she obeyed, scrambling onto the bed beside Tabitha. Tabitha's hand reached out, pulling her daughter close. Her gaze met Jedediah's across the room, a silent question filled with terror. He gave a slight, reassuring nod he didn't feel and stepped back outside his colt, now resting heavy and familiar at his hip. Silas and his men reined in their horses just outside the fence line. They didn't draw their weapons. This wasn't a raid. It was an assessment. Silas dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. He leaned against the fence post, hooking his thumbs in his belt, and gave Jedediah a slow, predatory smile. "Quite the homestead you've got here," Silas said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "A little slice of nowhere. Perfect for a man who wants to be forgotten." Jedediah remained silent on the porch, his hand resting on the rail inches from his gun. Silas's smile widened. He pushed his hat back, revealing intelligent, cruel eyes. "I heard you took in some strays. A man should be careful what strays he picks up. Sometimes they belong to someone else." His words were a direct echo of their confrontation in town, a clear and deliberate threat. "They're not strays," Jedediah said, his voice level. "And they don't belong to you." "Don't they?" Silas chuckled. He took a few steps along the fence, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the small barn and the cabin itself. "You know, you remind me of someone. A man I heard stories about. Lived a quiet life until trouble found him down in Blackwood Gulch." The name hit Jedediah like a physical blow. His blood ran cold. Blackwood Gulch. It wasn't a well-known place, a forgotten mining camp where his life had shattered. No one here knew he'd ever been there. Silas saw the flicker in Jedediah's eyes and pressed his advantage. "They say he was fast with a gun, too fast for his own good, caused a world of grief for himself and for others." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Jedediah, his smile gone, replaced by an unnerving intensity. "A man with that kind of skill. He doesn't just disappear, he just finds a new place to hide." This was no random outlaw. This was personal. Silas knew who he was. The bank robbery, Tabitha, the locket, it was all connected, a web spun with meticulous care. And Jedediah had walked right into its center. "You've said your piece," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Now get off my land." Silas held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy now. Just a friendly visit. Wanted to see the man who thought he could interfere in my business." He turned to remount his horse, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "That woman, she has something of mine, something her husband left behind. I aim to get it back. You tell her that. Tell her Silas Kane always collects his debts." He swung into the saddle and with a final chilling glance led his men away, their horses kicking up dust that settled slowly back onto the silent prairie. Jedediah stood on the porch long after they were gone, the name echoing in his mind. Kane. The same name as the man he had killed in the duel. It couldn't be a coincidence. He returned to the cabin, his face a mask of stone. Tabitha was sitting up, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond her physical injuries. "You heard?" Jedediah asked. She nodded, her hands twisting the fabric of the quilt. He's Daniel's brother." The confirmation settled in Jedediah's gut like a lead weight. Silas was not just some brute tormenting a helpless woman. He was the brother of the man Jedediah had killed. The conflict had just transformed from a simple rescue into a threatening, deeply personal mystery. He had driven them off for now, but this was far from over. He was no longer just a protector. He was the target. The revelation that Silas was a Kane changed everything. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken questions and shared history. For days, Jedediah circled the truth, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and dread. He started digging, trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges were soaked in blood. His first stop was Sheriff Elias. He found him in his office, painstakingly writing a report, his brow furrowed in concentration. Elias looked up as Jedediah entered, his expression wary. "Jedediah," he said, setting down his pen. "I was wondering when you'd be back." "I need to know about Tabitha's husband, Jedediah," said, getting straight to the point, Daniel. Elias leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. "Daniel Kane. A prospector. Came through here about a year ago with his wife and kid. Quiet man. Kept to himself mostly." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He fell in with Silas Blackwood, or Silas Kane, as you now know. Silas told everyone they were partners, that Daniel had found a promising gold claim up in the Ghostwood Hills." "What happened to him?" "An accident," Elias said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it for a second. "A cave-in at the mine they were supposedly working. Silas came back to town alone, all torn up about it. Said he barely made it out himself. We rode up there, but the entrance was completely collapsed. Never recovered the body. You think Silas killed him?" Jedediah asked. "I think Silas is the kind of man who takes what he wants," the sheriff replied carefully. "And I think it's mighty convenient his partner died right after finding gold. But I've got no proof. Just a bad feeling and a dead prospector." Jedediah left the sheriff's office with a heavier heart. The story was too neat, too clean. He returned to the ranch where Tabitha was slowly regaining her strength. He found her sitting on the porch watching Ruth chase butterflies in the tall grass. The domestic peace of the scene was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. As he approached, she looked up, her fear now mingled with a deep, abiding sorrow. She knew he had questions. "He told you his name, didn't he?" she whispered. "Silas Kane." Jedediah nodded, pulling up a crate to sit opposite her. "Tell me about the gold map, Tabitha." She flinched, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Daniel was a good man," she began, her voice trembling. "A dreamer? He was always chasing the next big strike. When we met Silas, he was so charming. He promised Daniel a full partnership, said they'd be rich." She swallowed hard. "Daniel found something, a rich vein of quartz laced with gold. He drew a map just in case anything happened. And Silas wants it," Jedediah finished for her. "Yes," she said, but her eyes wouldn't meet his. She recounted how after Daniel's death, Silas's charm had curdled into cruelty. He had tormented her, convinced she knew where the map was hidden. He'd beaten her, starved her, threatening Ruth if she didn't produce it. Her story was harrowing, and Jedediah felt a surge of protective fury. But something didn't feel right. Her words felt rehearsed, the details too vague. It was a story designed to elicit pity, not to reveal the truth. He suspected she was still hiding something, protecting a secret she feared was more dangerous than Silas himself. Later that day, while Tabitha rested, Jedediah went through the few belongings she and Ruth had brought with them. A small battered satchel containing a change of clothes, a worn-out storybook, and a small bundle of Daniel's things wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were prospecting tools, a geological hammer, and a slim, leather-bound journal. Jedediah flipped through its pages, which were filled with sketches of rock formations and notes on mineral deposits. Tucked into the back cover, folded into a tiny square, was a faded letter. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The letter was from Daniel, but it wasn't addressed to Tabitha. It was addressed to his older brother. It began, "Silas, if you are reading this, then our plan has gone wrong." Jedediah's blood ran cold as he read on. The letter spoke not of a partnership, but of a hunt. Daniel wrote of tracking a man for years, a ghost, who had vanished after bringing ruin to their family. He wrote of his guilt of using his wife and child as cover. to get close to a man living in seclusion near a town called Redemption. The letter ended with a chilling instruction. He killed our brother. He took everything from us. Do not let him escape again. His name is Jedediah. And then the final damning line. He doesn't know what he did. He thinks he killed a man named Cain, but he destroyed a family. The letter slipped from Jedediah's fingers. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty laid bare in faded ink. The man Jedediah had killed in that duel was not just Cain. He was Silas and Daniel's younger brother. The setting sun cast long, accusatory shadows across the cabin floor. Jedediah stood before Tabitha, the faded letter held loosely in his hand. The air between them was thick with the weight of years of secrets. Ruth was asleep in the corner, clutching her wooden horse, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Tabitha, Jedediah began, his voice low and heavy. I found this. He held out the letter. Her eyes widened in horror as she recognized it. The color drained from her face, leaving her bruises stark against her pale skin. She shook her head, a silent, desperate plea for him to stop. His name was Cain Jedediah, said his voice devoid of accusation, filled only with a deep, crushing sorrow. The man I killed in Blackwood Gulch. He was your husband's brother. A sob broke from Tabitha's throat, a raw, ragged sound of grief and guilt. The dam of her secrets finally burst. Tears streamed down her face as she collapsed into herself, her carefully constructed lies dissolving into a painful, unvarnished truth. Yes, she choked out between sobs. His name was Ethan, the youngest. He was foolish and proud, but he was their brother. Jedediah sank into the chair opposite her, the strength draining from his legs. The whole story reconfigured itself in his mind, the pieces snapping into a new, terrifying picture. The gold map, he whispered. There is no map, is there? She shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. No, it was a lie. A story Silas told the town to give them a reason to be here, a reason to torment us. The truth was always you. She explained everything, her voice halting and broken. After Ethan's death, Silas had been consumed by a thirst for vengeance. He had spent years hunting for the man responsible, the man who had vanished without a trace. When he finally got a lead that Jedediah was living a secluded life near Redemption, he devised a plan. Daniel, racked with guilt over his own inability to protect his younger brother, had agreed to help. They would use Daniel's prospecting as a cover to move into the area with Tabitha and Ruth as an innocent facade to allay suspicion. Daniel was supposed to get close to you, she whispered, her voice thick with shame. To confirm it was you. But he couldn't do it. He saw the way you lived, the isolation, the pain you carried. He wrote that letter to Silas, telling him he wanted out, that this revenge was wrong. And Silas killed him for it. Jedediah finished the grim reality settling over him. The cave-in wasn't an accident. It was an execution. Silas had murdered his own brother for wavering in their quest for vengeance. He came back from the mine and told me Daniel was dead. Tabitha continued, her body trembling. And then he told me the plan had changed. He wasn't going to just kill you. He wanted to destroy you first. He wanted to make you suffer. He beat me, kept us prisoners, knowing that eventually word of a desperate woman and child would reach the solitary man on the prairie. He was using us as bait. The horror of it washed over Jedediah. The bank robbery wasn't about money. It was a performance, a way for Silas to announce his presence and to see Jedediah up close. The locket he must have stolen, one that looked like Sarah's, a cruel psychological tool to draw him out. He had orchestrated everything, pulling the strings of Jedediah's grief and guilt with masterful cruelty. Jedediah looked at Tabitha, at the innocent child sleeping nearby, and the weight of his past actions crashed down on him with suffocating force. He wasn't protecting strangers from a greedy outlaw. He was protecting an innocent family from the consequences of a choice he had made years ago. His quest for a quiet life, his penance of solitude, was a selfish illusion. The ghost he thought he had outrun had not only caught up to him, it had brought with it a fresh wave of victims. His fight was no longer about defending his home. It was about confronting the man he used to be and paying the debt he truly owed. The truth once revealed left no room for subtlety. Silas, realizing his carefully laid trap had been sprung, knew he could no longer hide behind the pretense of a gold map. His vengeance needed a new catalyst, a more direct and brutal approach. He needed to force Jedediah out from behind the walls of his ranch and into a confrontation on his own terms. The opportunity came 3 days later. Jedediah, needing supplies and information, had ridden into Redemption, leaving Tabitha and Ruth with a stern warning to bar the door and stay inside. The trip was a risk, but a necessary one. He spoke briefly with Sheriff Elias, confirming his suspicions about Silas's true family name, and warning him that the situation was about to escalate. The sheriff, his face grim, promised to form a posse, but cautioned it would take time. Jedediah's heart was heavy with dread on the ride back. The prairie, usually a source of comfort in its vastness, felt menacing, each gust of wind sounding like a whispered threat. As his cabin came into view, a plume of thick black smoke, clawing at the sky, sent a spear of ice through his chest. He spurred his horse into a frantic gallop, his mind racing with terrible possibilities. He burst into the clearing to find his barn engulfed in flames. The fire roared, a hungry beast, consuming the dry timber, sending sparks and embers into the air like angry fireflies. But his relief that it was the barn and not the cabin was short-lived. The cabin door hung open, splintered at the frame. Tabitha, he roared, leaping from his horse before it had even stopped. Ruth. He ran inside. The cabin was in disarray, a chair overturned, a plate smashed on the floor. Tabitha lay near the hearth, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek, dazed but alive. She pushed herself up, her eyes wild with panic. He took her. She gasped, her voice raw with terror. Silas. He took Ruth. Jedediah's world tilted on its axis. The fire, the destruction, it was all a diversion. The true target had been the most vulnerable, the most innocent. He knelt beside Tabitha, his hands gripping her shoulders. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine, but Ruth. He dragged her out. He said you'd know where to find him. The old St. Michael's Church on the ridge, at stormrise. Her voice broke. He said she would pay for your sins. Jedediah helped her to her feet, his mind a cold, calculating machine. Fury, pure and undiluted, burned away his fear. This was no longer about his past or his guilt. It was about a little girl who had done nothing but exist. Nailed to the cabin door was a piece of paper. On it, scrawled in charcoal, were the words, "An eye for an eye, a child for a wife." He looked to the west. The sky was darkening, not with the approaching dusk, but with the bruised purple and gray of a coming storm. The clouds were building, churning a reflection of the tempest in his own soul. Stormrise. Silas had chosen the time and the place. Jedediah turned back to Tabitha. He pressed his spare revolver into her hands. Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me or the sheriff. Jedediah, no, she pleaded, clutching his arm. He'll kill you. He can try, Jedediah said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. He checked the action on his Colt, his movements swift and sure. He was no longer the hermit hiding from his past. The killer from Blackwood Gulch, the man he had tried to bury for years, was awake. And he was going to get Ruth back. He strode out of the cabin, the heat from the burning barn washing over him. He mounted his horse, his eyes fixed on the ridge, where the silhouette of a dilapidated church stood stark against the churning sky. The first rumble of distant thunder echoed across the prairie. It was the sound of a promise of retribution. The old church of St. Michael stood on the highest ridge overlooking the valley, a skeletal ruin against the bruised and turbulent sky. Its steeple was a jagged finger pointing at the heavens, and its windows were vacant eyes that had long since lost their stained glass. As Jedediah rode toward it, the storm broke. Rain began to fall first in fat sporadic drops, then in a torrential wind-driven sheet that turned the prairie into a sea of mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the clouds, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the very ground beneath his horse's hooves. He dismounted at the base of the ridge, tethering his horse in a small copse of weathered pines. He would approach on foot, a ghost in the storm. The wind howled around him, tearing at his coat, its roar a perfect match for the fury in his heart. Every flash of lightning illuminated his path up the treacherous muddy slope. Inside the church, a single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow. Silas was waiting. He stood near the crumbling altar, a revolver in his hand. Ruth was tied to one of the few remaining pews, a gag silencing her terrified cries, her small body trembling. Jedediah slipped through a collapsed section of the rear wall, his boots making no sound on the dirt-strewn floor. He moved through the shadows, using the thunder to mask his movements, his Colt held steady in his hand. "I know you're here, Jedediah," Silas called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I can smell the righteous anger on you. It's the same stench of arrogance you wore in Blackwood Gulch." Jedediah remained silent, circling around the edge of the room. "You took my brother from me." Silas continued, his voice rising with a raw, theatrical grief. "Ethan was young, foolish, but he was blood. And you shot him down over a card game. For that you owe a debt. The debt is with me." Jedediah said, his voice emerging from the shadows to Silas's left, causing him to startle and spin around. "Let the girl go." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was nearly swallowed by a clap of thunder. "Oh no, she's part of the payment. I wanted you to know what it feels like. To have the thing you care about most threatened. To feel that helplessness." He gestured with his gun toward Ruth. "First I took her, then I'll take you. And that woman of yours back at the ranch, she'll be last. Your entire world erased, just like you erased mine." In that moment, Jedediah understood the depth of Silas's madness. It wasn't just revenge. It was a desire for annihilation. "Your wife," Silas sneered, his eyes glittering in the lantern light. "Sarah. Pretty name. You think a stray bullet killed your precious Sarah. That's the story you told yourself, isn't it? The convenient lie that lets you wallow in guilt instead of facing the truth." Jedediah froze the name of his wife on this man's lips, a fresh violation. "There was no stray bullet," Silas said, savoring each word, twisting the knife. "After you ran like the coward, you are my men found her. We were looking for you, but we found her instead. We made sure she paid for what you did. We made it slow. An eye for an eye, Jedediah. That's the only justice there is." The world fractured. The foundation of Jedediah's grief, of the guilt that had defined him for years, crumbled into dust. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't his fault in the way he had believed. It was murder. Cold-blooded, calculated revenge. The weight of his self-blame was replaced by a white-hot cleansing rage. As lightning flashed, illuminating the church in a stark, brilliant glare, Jedediah moved. He didn't fire. He threw a loose floorboard, sending it clattering into the pews on the far side of the room. Silas, startled, fired into the darkness. It was the opening Jedediah needed. He lunged forward, tackling Silas, sending them both crashing to the floor. The fight was brutal and primal. They rolled across the muddy floor, fists and elbows flying. Thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire. Silas was strong, fueled by years of hate, but Jedediah was driven by something purer, the need to protect. He managed to disarm Silas, sending the revolver skittering away into the darkness. Silas scrambled back, grabbing a heavy piece of fallen timber. He swung it wildly, forcing Jedediah to retreat. Above them, the church's massive bronze bell loosened by the storm, and the decay of its supports swayed precariously in the steeple. Jedediah saw his chance. He dodged another swing and kicked out the rotted support beam holding up a section of the choir loft. With a groan of tortured wood, the loft began to collapse. Silas looked up in panic as debris rained down. It wasn't the loft Jedediah was aiming for. The collapsing timber struck the bell's housing, and with a final grinding screech of metal, the great bell broke free. Silas screamed as the bell plummeted downward, not on top of him, but in front of him, its massive bronze lip pinning his legs to the floor in a shower of splintered wood and dirt. He was trapped, wounded, but alive. Jedediah rushed to Ruth, his knife slicing through the ropes that bound her. He pulled the gag from her mouth and swept her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, her small body shaking uncontrollably. "It's okay," he whispered, stroking her hair. "You're safe now." He carried her out of the ruined church and into the cleansing rain, leaving Silas Kane pinned beneath the weight of his own broken vengeance, screaming curses that were lost in the fury of the storm. The rain had softened to a steady, gentle drizzle by the time Sheriff Elias and his posse arrived. Guided by the glow of the burning barn, they found Jedediah at the base of the ridge, sitting with Ruth wrapped in his coat, her exhausted sobs finally quieted. Jedediah explained what happened in clipped, precise sentences, his voice devoid of emotion. The posse found Silas where Jedediah had left him, trapped and delirious with pain and rage. They worked for an hour to free him, his legs crushed but his life intact. As they loaded him onto a makeshift stretcher, Elias walked over to Jedediah. "You could have killed him," the sheriff said, his voice a low statement of fact. "Justice isn't my place." Jedediah replied, his gaze distant. "It's yours." He had defeated Silas not through brute force, but by using his wits and the environment, proving, if only to himself, that he was more than the killer Silas believed him to be. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. The barn was a smoldering skeleton, hissing in the rain. As he approached the cabin, the door was flung open. Tabitha stood there, his revolver still clutched in her hands, her face a mess of tear-streaked relief. She saw Ruth safe in his arms and let out a sound that was half sob, half prayer. She rushed forward, gathering her daughter into an embrace so fierce it seemed she might never let go. Later, after Ruth had been fed and put to bed, the exhaustion of her ordeal finally claiming her, Jedediah and Tabitha sat at the small table. The silence in the cabin was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the night's revelations. Jedediah knew what he had to do. The half-truths and protective omissions were over. He owed her the whole, unvarnished story. He started at the beginning in Blackwood Gulch with the foolish pride that led to the duel. He told her about Kane's death, about his shame, and about the lie he had believed for years regarding Sarah's death. Then, his voice cracking with a pain that was still fresh and raw, he told her what Silas had revealed in the church. "He was murdered because of me." Jedediah finished, his voice barely a whisper. "And your husband, and everything Silas did to you. It all started with a choice I made." He laid his past bare, offering no excuses, no pleas for understanding. He exposed the ugliest parts of himself, the guilt and violence he had tried so hard to bury. He expected her to recoil, to hate him for the part he played in the destruction of her family. Tabitha listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he was finished, she was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. "You're not the only one who lived with a lie," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I knew what Silas was. I knew this was about revenge, not gold. I lied to you because I was afraid. I thought if you knew the truth, you'd cast us out, leave us to him. I was a coward." "You were trying to protect your daughter," Jedediah said. "And you," she replied, her gaze meeting his, "are trying to protect her now." She reached across the table, her hand hesitantly covering his. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, not yet. It was too soon, the wounds too deep for that. But it was one of understanding. A recognition of shared burdens of two broken people caught in the same tragic story, finding solace not in absolution, but in the simple, profound act of telling the truth. In the quiet of the damaged cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of their pasts, the first fragile seeds of healing began to take root. Weeks passed. The prairie healed itself, the scorched earth around the barn sprouting new green shoots of grass. The rhythms of life on the ranch settled into a new normal one, marked by the sound of a child's laughter and the quiet companionship of two adults learning to navigate the landscape of their shared trauma. The town of Redemption, having heard the full story from Sheriff Elias, began to change its tune. Nods on the street became warmer, the whispers less judgmental. People saw Jedediah not as a reclusive oddity, but as the man who had faced down Silas Cain and protected a family. He was no longer a ghost. He was a neighbor. One quiet evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, Jedediah sat at his table, the small leather pouch from his chest open before him. He took out the two identical silver lockets. One was his wife's, its surface dulled by time. The other was Ruth's, now polished and clean from the mud of the church. He opened Sarah's locket first, his thumb stroking the worn-down edges of her tiny photograph. For the first time, he looked at it, not with guilt, but with a profound, aching love. As he did, his finger brushed against a tiny, almost invisible etching on the inside of the cover, something he had never noticed in all his years of grieving. He held it close to the lantern light. 4 small words were scratched into the silver: "My love, my forgiveness." She had known the duel was not his choice, but a trap of pride and circumstance. She had forgiven him before he had even known he needed it. A single tear fell from his eye, splashing onto the metal. It was the release he had been searching for a decade. He closed the locket gently and placed it on the mantelpiece above the hearth, a respectful memorial to the past, but no longer a source of active grief. He had finally forgiven himself. He then picked up the second locket. He walked to the doorway where Ruth was sitting on the steps, humming to herself. He knelt before her and held it out. "I believe this is yours," he said softly. Her face lit up with a smile that was pure sunshine. "You fixed it," she exclaimed, taking it from him. She fumbled with the clasp and opened it. Inside were 2 new tiny portraits, one of her mother and one of Jedediah. He watched as Tabitha came and sat beside her daughter, her hand resting on Ruth's shoulder. She looked up at Jedediah, her eyes conveying a depth of gratitude and affection that needed no words. Together, they watched the last of the sun disappear below the horizon. The next morning, Jedediah looked out the window and saw Tabitha and Ruth in a small patch of tilled earth beside the cabin. They were planting wildflowers, their heads bent together in concentration. It was the first time flowers had ever been planted on this property. The first sign of deliberate, hopeful life. He realized then that he was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he had chosen to protect. His solitude had been a prison of his own making, and love in its quiet, patient, and unexpected form had been the key. He was home not just in the cabin, but within himself. The silence he had once craved was gone, replaced by something far more precious, the gentle, resilient sound of a family beginning to grow.